This episode discusses crime scenes, murder, and violence. Listener discretion is advised. This is The Fall Line. One of our goals with this show is to help our audience better understand forensic science in the pursuit of justice for cold cases. We've had plenty of experts weigh in on everything from forensic anthropology to odontology. But perhaps the subject that we've most often discussed is the use of FIGG, Forensic Investigative Genetic Genealogy, to solve crimes that were once considered impossible to close. Those episodes have gone over the basics of DNA and how genealogy has changed the game, and you can check those out if you haven't had an introduction to the subject. We will link them in the show notes. We've covered everything from the difference between classic STR testing, like the kind of samples uploaded to CODIS, to the whole genome sequence SNP test used for FIGG, and we've interviewed scientists and genealogists alike to break down the concepts for you. One of those experts is Cairenn Binder, and you last heard Cairenn on our episode featuring Leo Jane Doe, and Detective Filter brought up her work in our mid-season episode regarding updates in the unidentified persons cases in Nashville, Tennessee. But we have never sat down with Cairenn to talk about her background and her work, so I invited her to join me for an in-depth interview. She was one of the earliest IGG practitioners with DNA Doe Project, and also works on private cases with her own company. She also co-founded the AIGG programs at Ramapo College in New Jersey, where students can train in 3 different tracks to study IGG, a certificate program, a boot camp, and as part of their traditional 4-year college experience. I wanted to speak with Cairenn about her experience as someone who's been there since the very beginning and has watched the landscape radically shift. She can tell us about the past, the present, and the future, and what her worries and her hopes are. It has now been 7 years since the first forensic solve was announced using FIGG. So, what will the next 7 look like? Cairenn's here to tell us about that and much more. And just a note at the top, you'll hear Cairenn and I use terms like FIGG, FIG, FIGG, and IGG. Basically, there's just not a standard term in the field, and Cairenn tells me it's even a point of contention and debate as to what the standardization could be. But Cairenn prefers IGG, or Investigative Genetic Genealogy, so she will use that term throughout our discussion. I asked Cairenn to introduce herself, and then get into her background.
My name is Cairenn Binder, and just to provide the spelling of my first name, because that confuses a lot of people, my name is spelled Cairenn. I'm an investigative genetic genealogist, and I've been practicing in the field of what I call IGG since 2018. So my job is to help identify unidentified human remains and suspect DNA from crime scenes to solve a variety of different case types. And so I use genealogy and advanced DNA testing to do all of that. I think some of the listeners will really relate to this story because when I started out, I'm a person that grew up watching Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack, and I was an early, Redditor. I was on the true crime subreddits and kind of researching cases and reading the Charlie Project to learn about missing persons cases before I was doing IGG. Meanwhile, I've had a long time, family mystery. My mom is adopted, and I grew up knowing that she was adopted and not knowing anything about her birth family. And that was something that pulled at me from the time I was a little kid. I always wanted to know where she came from. I even wanted to know, what was the orphanage like where she was given up for adoption. I wanted to know the answers to all of this. And so when I was a kid, my mom gave me this box of letters that she had exchanged through the adoption agency with her birth mother. And they had contacted one another a couple of times. Everything was de-identified. So on these letters, there were like blacked out with permanent marker sections where if I just knew what was under that permanent marker, I could figure out who her birth mom was and who her siblings were. All this information was right there at my fingertips, but I just couldn't see it. And all of that changed when genealogy became available via the internet. So the early days, when I was a teenager, RootsWeb was an online genealogy platform, and then later on Ancestry. And then finally Ancestry DNA came out, and that was, the mid 2010s. And I bought my mom and myself a DNA test. And so that unlocked the ability to figure out with certainty who her biological parents were. And from there, I was hooked. So I started helping other adoptees. My mom actually has a first cousin who was also adopted, and I helped him figure out who his birth mom was, my mom's sister. And from there, I got into this, I got a little bit addicted to this DNA stuff. At the same time, so this was in 2018, that I was researching a John Doe called Lyle Stevick. And he was an unidentified man that was found in the state of Washington in 2001. And I learned that there was an organization that had just started called DNA Doe Project, and they were going to try to identify him. And they were taking volunteer applications for people like me who had some experience helping adoptees to use this DNA technology in a new way to identify human remains. And so I was one of the first people that had the opportunity to join the team at DNA Doe Project. And from there, the rest is history. I spent 6 years with DDP solving unidentified human remains cases. And then I transitioned to my career here at Ramapo College in 2022.
When you were working on those early adoption cases using ancestry and genealogy, were you using DNA to help with that, or were those earliest cases simply using family trees?
It was both. So with my mom's case specifically, I had mentioned those letters that her mom wrote, and she gave some information that turned out to be useful to me. For example, she gave her birthday. My mom's mother wrote down what her birthday is. She also put her first name, but her last name was blacked out. And then she wrote the name of her children, the first names of all of them. And she mentioned that two of her children were twins. And then I can't remember what the detail was, that one of the details that I found, indicated to me that her youngest child had passed away. And so eventually I was able to find the death record for her youngest son who had died by suicide. And it named his mom, who was my mom's mother. And then when I looked up her, I found her birth record, and it matched up with the letter from my mom's mom to my mom. And with that, I was able to figure out on paper who her birth mother was with certainty. So I had her first name, her last name, and her children's names. But then later on, DNA finished the puzzle for me. So I was able to verify those connections. It wasn't just a coincidence that this person had the right name, right birthday, all of that stuff. So I knew for sure that that was her mom. And then I was also able to solve her dad. And then from there, the other adoptees that I helped, it was always with DNA as well. And I still do that today. I have a small business where I still help adoptees and people with family tree mysteries to solve their mysteries, in addition to all of the IGG stuff that I do.
I don't know if people are aware that when investigative genetic genealogists work, it really is a combination of heavy-duty, enhanced, really in-depth research along with a really nuanced understanding of DNA and how it works. It's not just working with DNA, right?
Absolutely. That analytical brain is such an important piece of it. There have been times when the context clues were more powerful than the stuff that we found with DNA. In fact, I've worked on cases where the subject themselves, like the person that I was trying to identify, turned out to be adopted. And so I needed all of these other clues to put everything together and find the solution, really. And that's one reason why I think a lot of people ask me about career advice in IGG. Like, if I become an investigative genetic genealogist, how can I do this as a career? And I think the answer to that is in the analyst position. That's often part of the police. So, for example, in GBI in Georgia, where you live, they have criminal or intelligence analysts that support the investigative team by doing things like reviewing cell phone records or looking at cell phone tower pings or seeing an address history of an individual to see if they ever lived near a crime scene. All of that stuff is the same kind of research that, when applied to DNA and genealogy, and then also finding those context clues, can help solve mysteries. So those people will be armed with investigative genetic genealogy skills, and they'll be supplementing the work that they already do by using IGG to help investigate cases with DNA.
One thing Cairenn highlighted was how radically timelines have changed for IGG practitioners as the databases themselves have grown.
One of the earlier cases of kind of investigative genetic genealogy, but kind of not, is the Bear Brook case in New Hampshire. The genealogist that worked on that for many years is Barbara Ray Venter, and she solved 2 of the 3 unidentified human remains cases related to that case. And she had also identified a living doe, a person who ended up being cared for, I think initially in foster care and later adopted, this little girl named Lisa, who had been abandoned by her parent or parents. And it was all related to that investigation. So Barbara Ray Venter helped Lisa find her biological identity. And she had done this years ago, back in the early stages of Ancestry DNA and 23andMe. And she had said on another podcast that she was speaking about the case that she redid the work a few years later, and it took her a matter of hours, something that had taken years before that. And that's because of the increase in the number of people in the databases like Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, MyHeritage. That was for a living person, so they had access to a lot more databases than what we have in IgG cases. But it just goes to show that with the popularity of DNA testing now, people that had no hope in finding their biological parents back, even just a few years ago, now could have, close relative matches in those databases.
However, Cairenn stressed that adoption-based work is separate from forensic work, which cannot be done in consumer databases.
It's against the terms of service for Ancestry and 23andMe and MyHeritage to be used for these types of investigative cases. So what people could do if they're, just learning right now, oh my gosh, my DNA is not helping solve cold cases, you can change that. You could download your raw DNA data from 23andMe or Ancestry or MyHeritage, and you could upload it to Family Tree DNA, GEDmatch, and DNA Justice for free. And not only does that give you access to new tools and new genetic relatives that you might not have had on the database that you're already in, but it also allows us to search against your profile so that we can solve cases.
We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Styles McKenzie helping you make those rooms sing. Today's style tip: when it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild, like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Arr, fierce. This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
We told you Cairenn was one of the earliest volunteers at DNA Doe Project. She also works on cases through her own company and at Ramapo College. I asked her to estimate just how many solves she's participated in over the past 7 years.
There's a number of cases that I feel that I've contributed to the solution of, and then there's the cases that I've just kind of touched. And so if I'm talking about cases that I've touched, then it's probably around 100, I would say. I know that when I left DNA Doe Project, I think I had solved around 27, and then now I've been at Ramapo since 2022, and here I'm part of every solve, and we've solved around 30 cases at this point, some of which are public and some are not.
You've always worked collaboratively, right?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the best things about IGG is being part of a team working towards a common goal. When I was at DDP, I started out as a volunteer investigative genetic genealogist. So I was one of the people that was working on cases directly doing genealogy. And then later on, I ended up working as a volunteer coordinator. So I helped review new applications for volunteers that were incoming into the field. Later on, I was promoted to the director of education and director of development. And so I was involved with fundraising, running education programs, and sort of helping to manage some of the day-to-day stuff that went on at DDP. So I was, very pleased to become part of the leadership team towards the end of my tenure there. In 2022, my boss at DNA Doe Project, Margaret Press, introduced me to my now boss, David Gurney, here at Ramapo College. He's a professor of law and society, and then he's also a licensed attorney in New Jersey and Arizona. So we started meeting for coffee just to talk about investigative genetic genealogy because he was thinking about implementing some education programs for IGG here at Ramapo College. Ramapo College is a small liberal arts college. It's a public institution in northern New Jersey, and I live in New York, which is about 35 minutes from this campus. And meanwhile, by the way, I was working in healthcare. I was a healthcare educator, a registered nurse educator at the time. And David had this idea to potentially create an investigative genetic genealogy center where there would be education programs, casework, and research performed in the field of investigative genetic genealogy. And when we were talking about that, we thought of all these different things that we could do. We could work on real cases. We could educate people both in person and online. We could run boot camps for people to have these sort of intensive work periods on specific cases. We could offer pro bono case assistance that could be funded by the education programs. We could hold a conference. To my amazement, Ramapo thought it was a good idea too. This kind of came at the perfect time because they were accepting these proposals called priority needs proposals, which would be things to help the college increase its profile, generate revenue, and create learning for students. And so in December 2022, the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center officially launched, and we took on our first cases, and then we had our first Investigative Genetic Genealogy Certificate program, which is an online program, occur in spring of 2023. So all of our dreams really came true from just those few meetings over the summer of 2022.
So I would love for you to tell me about the programs because you have 3 different tracks for students, right?
That's right. We have the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Certificate program, which I would say is our most popular program. I mean, anybody can take it as long as they're over 18, but it is mostly adult learners, often police officers, crime and intelligence analysts, DNA analysts, people that are related to law enforcement. Also, people that are not related to law enforcement. So this is a 15-week online program where students learn how to do investigative genetic genealogy, and then they practice their skills on a real case. So they actually get to work on and hopefully solve at least one case during their time in the program. And then we also have the IGG workshop, which is for in-person students at Ramapo. So these are undergrads that are already taking classes at Ramapo in the Law and Society degree program or our other degree programs here on campus. And then finally, we have our Investigative Genetic Genealogy Bootcamp. This is a 1-week summer program for 16 students per bootcamp. And in this program, they are coming to campus in real life to live together and have a chance to work on real cases. The energy in the room at boot camp is incredible. The boot camp is for students that have already had experience in IGG. So they are usually people that took the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Certificate program. And now that they finished that, they know what they're doing. They can come to boot camp to have this in-person casework experience.
I asked Cairenn what students who've completed Ramapo's programs are prepared to do once they leave.
Well, I'm going to speak to the online certificate program because that's the one that I teach, that I'm the director of. So students that leave the program, they know how to work an IGG case from start to finish. They haven't had a lot of practice yet because they've only had a chance to work on maybe 1, 2, or 3 cases in their time in the program. But they have that recipe for success. And with more experience, they can grow the same expertise that I've grown from working on dozens of cases over the years.
A major inspiration for these programs was the growing need for formalization of IGG in criminal investigation, which is something we discussed in Cairenn's interview.
So as far as formalizing the training for investigative genetic genealogists, when I was a nurse educator, there were tons of programs available. There's, thousands of nursing programs around the country that teach people how to be a nurse. And then you have thousands of programs. Every hospital has a new graduate program. So a lot of this training has already been looked at. But again, with investigative genetic genealogy, there are only a handful of programs that teach investigative genetic genealogy. Of course, there's Ramapo College, which is where I work. There is forensic genealogy for law enforcement, which was started by Anthony and Lee Redgrave of Redgrave Research. There is University of New Haven. They have a postgraduate certificate for forensic genetic genealogy. And then Joan Hanlon of United Data Connect teaches a course. So there's a handful of courses throughout the United States. But there's still development going on of what should investigative genetic genealogy education look like. And of course, I'm a little bit biased because I work at Ramapo, and we've seen it in action because our students do solve cases. And in fact, many of them have gone on to graduate, work for police, or start their own genealogy companies and go on and solve more cases after they finish the program. So that's another really exciting piece to be part of, that not only are we solving cases at Ramapo, but we're also teaching the next generation of IGG practitioners that are going to be solving cases all over the world.
And one thing you and I were talking about was also just the concept of methods and best practices, which is something you and I both discussed in our graduate school experiences to great extent with our mentors, right? And is that something you're also bringing to your students?
Yes, I serve on a board called the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Accreditation Board. And, I hate to keep on using like healthcare references, but it's just how it is. I mean, healthcare gives me a good example because, of course, in healthcare, you have standards. To become a registered nurse, I had to go to nursing school, and then I had to prove that I had the knowledge to be a nurse by serving in a new graduate program and taking the NCLEX exam. And that allowed me to get those letters after my name, registered nurse RN. The same thing now exists in investigative genetic genealogy, where there is a set of standards that a consortium of IGG practitioners have put together. And that consortium, again, is called AIGG, or the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Accreditation Board. And that can be found at igab.org. So they have a set of ethical standards and guidelines, as well as best practices and, knowledge that every IGG practitioner should be aware of. And they have an accrediting exam. So I'm really excited that I was just able to take the accreditation exam about a month ago. So I'm an AIGG accredited investigative genetic genealogist. And I think that those standards are so important. And thankfully, because I'm on the advisory board, I did get some input. And when those standards were developed, what do I think is important for IGG practitioners to know? And because the investigative genetic genealogists that have been practicing for years, since 2017, 2018, on real cases, had a chance to give input into those standards.
So I'd love to talk a little bit more about the kind of cases that you take on at Ramapo, where the funding comes from, and how law enforcement can seek that funding. So what kind of cases can Ramapo students take on, and what kind of cases can you not take on?
Law enforcement has to refer the case to us because we need access to the DNA to perform DNA testing in order to take the case. So whether it's a wrongful conviction and we're working with the attorney of the convicted person to facilitate DNA testing, or whether it's unidentified human remains and the medical examiner's office has consulted us to perform DNA testing, or it's a detective or investigator that has referred us the case and we're working with their state crime lab to perform the DNA testing that we need to do this genealogy process. We can take on cases of unidentified human remains and violent crimes. And those violent crimes also include wrongful convictions. So I'm going to break that down a little bit further. So unidentified human remains, those are John and Jane Doe cases, many of which have been discussed on the fall line. And then violent crimes are defined in different ways by the different database terms of service, as well as by the Department of Justice guidelines, but generally include murder, rape, and aggravated assault, and sometimes kidnapping. So those are the types of cases that can be worked with IGG. There's some places that have a bit of nuance. So infant unidentified human remains, different IGG practitioners might have different standards for what kind of infant cases they accept. At Ramapo, we only accept cases where the manner of death is determined to be homicide if it's an infant case. And then I just want to carve out wrongful convictions for a second, because those are where a person has already been convicted of a violent crime, such as a murder or sexual assault. But the person who is in prison, incarcerated for this murder, or accused or convicted of this murder, their DNA does not match the crime scene DNA. And so then our job as IGG practitioners is to identify whose DNA is this really, because it could be the true perpetrator rather than the person that is being accused or having been convicted of this crime.
I'd also love to hear about where the funding for cases comes from, how law enforcement can seek out that funding, and also how lab work is handled. Are you doing that out of the college? Is the college handling some of the lab work?
Ooh, we're touching on my hopes and dreams now. So our funding for the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center and all the cases that we work comes from a couple of different places. The main source of funding is our education programs. So I hope that any Ramapo grads that are listening to this are very happy to learn that the money that you paid to take the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Certificate program goes into our budget that we are then able to turn around and use for the lab work and to pay our staff that work on cases. So most of our funding comes from education programs. The other piece of our funding comes from donors. So there was an initial gift given to Ramapo to start the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center, which helped to fund us for our first 3 years. And we also have ongoing donors who support things like our casework. So some of our money comes from donors as well, but most of it comes from our education programs. To get access to that funding for law enforcement need only send me an email or send us an inquiry on our website, ramapo.edu/IGG. That's how you can put in a case referral. We do ask that agencies that have the funds to cover the laboratory testing in their cases, that they use those funds for that. However, agencies that need our funding, so perhaps a rural agency or one that is experiencing funding cuts, we're happy to help them out by paying for the testing. We don't have an unlimited budget. I wish we did. We use a variety of different lab partners to take our cases from, raw DNA to a usable file that we can use for genetic genealogy. We outsource all of our lab testing for, bone extractions, different types of samples, sequencing or microarray genotyping and bioinformatics. All of that stuff is outsourced. I do hope in the future that we can do it at Ramapo because we do have a genetics program, we have biology programs, and it would be so neat if our undergrads in those programs could benefit from what we're doing. And we certainly wouldn't be the first university to have a laboratory in-house. So I do hope that in the future, maybe 5 or 10 years from now, that we'll be able to have our lab work in-house, and then our students here can learn from that piece of it as well as learning the investigation piece.
So one thing you just mentioned that I want to circle back to very quickly was your Borderland Scholarship. And I just want to highlight that because it is vitally important. And it's something we've talked about on the show before, the lack of DNA and how difficult it is to work on cases at the border.
Absolutely. So there are a number of challenges to working on Borderlands cases. And I know that there's more than one migration pattern in the United States. But if we look at the states at the southwest border, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, there are thousands and thousands of unidentified human remains cases, many of whom have not even had the basic types of DNA testing, much less having investigative genetic genealogy performed. And there are very few groups and organizations that are committed to specifically performing investigative genetic genealogy research for those individuals. So not only do we have this sort of personnel problem and just the sheer number of people that need to be identified, but also there's an underrepresentation of people in the DNA databases that are from those populations. And that makes it more difficult to identify them. So if you were to put my DNA in GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, you would find some pretty close matches. Even if you were taking out my family members that I've tested, you would find that I have several second cousin matches in the database. And you could identify me using those second cousin matches. But if you were to take my best friend, who's Mexican, she has very few close genetic relatives in the database. Her closest match is between a third to fifth cousin. And that's not even that bad. Third to fifth cousin, that would be okay. But many people of Latin American descent have only very, very distant genetic relatives in GEDmatch and family tree DNA. And that makes it more difficult for us to identify them, because the farther back in the family tree that the connection to their relatives is, the more obscure the chance that you're going to find out who they are is. It's just a matter of how many different degrees of separation that they are from their genetic relatives. Besides that, in other countries, you have difficulties with records. Mexico, we have great coverage of genealogy records in Mexico generally, but a lot of other Latin American countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, Ecuador, we don't have good coverage of genealogy records the way that we do for people that are from the United States. So all of these different challenges come together and make it often impossible to identify a person of Latin American descent who passed away trying to cross the border, to identify them using investigative genetic genealogy. So there's a couple of things that we're doing at Ramapo to help with that. One of them is our Latin American DNA project, where each year some of our staff and alumni and volunteers travel to Tucson, Arizona, and we're also planning to add more locations in the future. And we distribute DNA kits, which are donated by Family Tree DNA, to the people that attend certain festivals. So the Latin American project has been, for the past 3 years, held at the Tucson Festival of Books in Tucson. We actually also distributed kits for the project at the True Crime Podcast Festival in Texas back in 2023. So this project has, over time, added hundreds of Latin American individuals to the databases, and we actually see those show up in our actual cases that we're working on of Latin American decedents. We see these kits that we've distributed show up in their match lists, which is really cool. So we're seeing a real impact. And I hope that when we've been doing this project for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, it will start to make a discernible difference in the representation of Latin Americans in those DNA databases. Keep in mind that these are consenting individuals. They know what their DNA is being used for, and they maintain control of their DNA results. So if they want to take it out of the database at any point, they can. But this is something that we hope will, over time, help make bodies at the borders more identifiable and help them be returned to their families. One of our graduates of our certificate program donated an annual scholarship called the Borderlands Humanitarian Scholarship. And this allows us to bring in one student each fall into the IGG certificate program that specifically wants to work and impact Borderlands work.
Earlier in our discussion, Cairenn mentioned that students at Ramapo work on cold cases, and they often help resolve them. I asked her to tell us about some of those experiences. Can you talk to us about some of the cases that your students have worked on and solved?
Oh, I love this. I love this question because we are so proud of some of the cases that we've been able to work on here. I'll start with some of the ones that are fresh in my mind. So at our boot camp in 2023, our first boot campers ever worked on the case of a wrongful conviction. There were two brothers named Robert and David Bintz that were convicted of the 1987 murder of Sandra Lyson, who was a bartender in Wisconsin, and she was killed while working at her shift at the Good Times bar. 13 years later, these two brothers who did live near the crime scene, and, they had a history of, getting in trouble, they were convicted of this crime. And the really unfortunate thing about this is that there was always DNA on Sandra's remains, both blood and semen, which did not match Robert and David Bintz. And for whatever reason, the prosecution was able to, come up with an explanation for why this other person's blood and semen was on her. And they were able to secure a conviction for Robert and David. And so Robert and David spent 25 years in prison for a crime that they didn't commit. In 2023, our students that were at boot camp figured out whose DNA that really was. And it took a lot of work. The person had to be exhumed since they were already deceased. Another comparison of their DNA had to be ordered. And eventually we figured out that person, whose name was William Hendricks, was the person whose both blood and semen, again, were found on Sandra. And so that allowed the brothers to be exonerated. And I have to give credit to everybody that was involved in that. The students that were at boot camp, the investigators who reopened the case, the attorneys that fought so hard for Robert and David, everybody that allowed this to finally come to a resolution. Although, is it really a resolution? Because Robert and David still lost 25 years of their lives in prison. But, today they're free. Our students work on a lot of unidentified human remains cases. One of the ones that's closest to my heart is that of Norm Grasser. He was formerly called Rhinelander John Doe, and he was found in northern Wisconsin in 1980. And he had actually gone missing from Chicago that same year. He was reported missing by his family. But I think because they were in different states, this is before law enforcement was really using computers for everything, the investigators were never able to put together the unidentified body in Wisconsin with the missing man from Chicago until 2023, when our first cohort of the IGG certificate program worked on that case, and they were able to find actually his brother was in one of the databases. So they brought that case to a resolution quite quickly with their research and found that after all those years, Norm Grasser was Rhinelander John Doe. And that brought answers to his brother who had been looking for him for all those years. Some of our other cases that are violent crimes, I can't talk about yet because there's stuff going on behind the scenes that makes them not public yet. But one that I will be able to talk about is the murder of Mary Schlase. Mary Schlase was a young woman who was killed in 1974, and unfortunately her body was left just on the side of the road like trash. Really upsetting case, and she had been stabbed to death. Mary had been a really gifted, successful, talented artist, and she was hitchhiking to an art show when somebody picked her up and then apparently murdered her. That case went unsolved for literally 50 years until our team took a look at it between 2023 and 2024. And even though the perpetrator was an adoptee, we were still able to solve it. So just last year in September of 2024, John Keith Miller, who was 84 years old, was arrested for Mary's murder, and he pled no contest just a few weeks ago. And so he's now been convicted of this murder that was 50 years ago. And Mary's family is still living. Her brother, now has an answer to what happened to her after all these years. And John Keith Miller, I know that it's really still not justice because he got 50 years that she didn't have. But I still think it means something to give some answers to the family after all this time and to have him behind bars for what he did to Mary.
Cairenn told us that while plenty of students are civilians, a large percentage are members of law enforcement or otherwise involved in criminal justice. I asked her how IGG training informs their understanding of cold cases.
I think it leads to a hopefulness that maybe they didn't have before about the investigative power of what we can do now with DNA. Before, it used to be DNA testing is done. Oh, there's no hit in CODIS. Oh, now we can do nothing but wait and see if there's a hit in CODIS. Today, we can get more knowledge from that same DNA sample than we could 10 years ago. It's new hope for cases that seemed hopeless before. So I think that's one piece of it. And the other piece of it is that it can be transformative. So we have a conference at Ramapo each year called RIGG. And this year, our keynote speakers are two investigators from Orange County Sheriff's Department, and their names are Bob Taft and Lauren Felix. I've known them for years, and I knew them kind of early on, the first IGG cases that they ever worked on. And then later on, they both took my class. And I see how over the past 7 years, their department transformed as a result of IGG. They're both on cold case. And so some of their cold cases, unidentified human remains, murders, rapes, victims of serial killers have now been identified, have been solved using investigative genetic genealogy. So opening up that old box of files, they can have hope now that they have this new tool. It's the same as if we had just discovered fingerprinting. We have just discovered this new tool that they can use that can close those old cases. So I think transformative is the word that keeps coming to mind for me.
I love talking to you about this because you sound so excited and hopeful. So What are your hopes for this program, which is still so young, in the future?
Well, so many of our dreams have already come true. I'm very lucky because my boss, I mentioned that we just met over coffee a couple years ago, and there has been nothing that my boss has said no to. Like if I'm like, I want to do this crazy thing, I want us to go distribute DNA kits. He's like, okay, let's do that in Tucson. I know of this festival. There's never a thing where it's like, no, we can't do that because it's too hard. It's too crazy. We just do it. So with that, I do think that in the future, that idea of having an in-house lab, so that more students and more cases can benefit from the work that we do, I think that's possible. It's on the horizon. I'm not a scientist myself, so it would require cooperation from more people than just me and my boss. But I think that that's in the future for us potentially. Another thing is, like I said, with the Latin American DNA Project, I hope that in my lifetime, I can make an impact there.
As any new field develops, issues come up. That's inevitable. We've seen that with emerging forensic sciences, both those that establish themselves as true game changers and fields that eventually were classified as problematic or even junk science. FIGG has certainly proven transformative and legitimate, but questions of usage, ethics, and even misapplication and misinterpretation continue to surface as cases make their way to the courts. Cairenn and I discussed current and potential future issues for the field as more cases are solved. The biggest current discussion, of course, has been the use of IGG in the Idaho 4 case, where a few IGG issues have already surfaced. First, as CBS News reported in January of 2025, quote, in Kohberger's case, investigators said they found, quote, touch DNA or trace DNA on the sheath of a knife that was found in the home where students were fatally stabbed. The FBI used the IGG process on that DNA, and the information identified Kohberger as a possible suspect. Defense attorney Ann Taylor had argued that police never sought warrants to analyze the DNA found at the crime scene, nor did they get warrants to analyze the DNA of potential relatives that had been submitted to genealogy databases. She argued the court should suppress the IGG identification and everything that came from it. The judge said that in order to throw out the evidence based on a warrantless search, Kohberger's defense would need to show that he had legitimate expectation of privacy in the item or place searched. End quote. So that was one issue. The second, per the New York Times, relates to database usage. As Cairenn explained earlier in the episode, only certain public databases can be used for forensic cases, and only with explicit consent through a probe portal. But the New York Times reported that the FBI used GEDmatch and MyHeritage, which is not cleared for forensic comparison. But, per CNN, the judge did allow the DNA evidence from the consumer database.
So we've seen IGG go through the courts a handful of times now. One case that's coming to mind, of course, is the Kohberger case in Idaho, still on trial. And there's been a lot of testimony from IGG practitioners, other people that are tangentially related to investigative genetic genealogy, people that are critics of investigative genetic genealogy. In the Kohberger case, we saw that the investigating agency, which I believe was the FBI, used some techniques to investigate the case, which would not be the standard or routine practice in IGG and go against the terms of service of one of the databases that was used. And so when that happened, there's an argument that perhaps from the FBI perspective and even perhaps the public safety perspective, you could see that the goal was to identify a person that committed an extremely violent crime where 4 people were killed. And then from the IGG practice, the IGG field perspective, this could potentially make a concern for the public's perception of how IGG is used. if they don't know which databases they're able to consent to its use for investigative genetic genealogy. So that's one of the concerns that I have playing out in the media and in the court system of how the practice or the field as a whole could be impacted by one specific case.
And Cairenn says that loss of public trust is just one of her concerns.
I haven't really talked about this yet, but it's one of the focuses of the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center to use IGG to overturn more wrongful convictions. But one thing that concerns me is that IGG represents a investigative technique that amplifies our previous ability to use a DNA sample for investigations. So, for example, touch DNA or transfer DNA or hair can be used to identify an individual whose DNA is at a crime scene. But just to give you an example, my husband works at a school. In the morning, if I give my husband a hug and then one of my hairs from my head sheds onto his shoulder, and then he goes and works in his school, one of my hairs could end up in his office. And that means that my DNA is in a place where I've never been before. And so when we think about the use of IGG to investigate DNA samples that previously we couldn't identify who they belonged to, we also have the potential to make assumptions about why that DNA is there. But just because a person's DNA is at a crime scene doesn't mean that they are the person that committed that crime. So that's the thing that's the third concern that I have is, now that we have this new way to identify DNA, will it be used against the wrong individual? So that's a thing that scares me a little bit, because there could be a perfectly reasonable reason why a person was at a crime scene. It doesn't have to be because they're the person that committed that crime. It could be something else.
Cairenn also talked about her hopes for the future, what she thinks may develop in the next decade.
Well, one thing that we've been seeing recently is the use of direct SNP to SNP testing coming about and being proven in the courts. And so this is the advanced DNA technology that allows us to do investigative genetic genealogy. It's called SNP testing. And it used to be that only STRs, which is the traditional type of DNA testing, had gone through the type of court hearings that allow it to be introduced as evidence against a defendant. So I hope to see that type of technology go through the court system in all 50 states so that it can be used to help exonerate people and help convict people that have performed a violent crime. So that's one hope that I have for the future, is that basically the type of DNA testing that we use will be legitimized and will make its way through the court system in the United States. I would also love to see IGG be adopted by more countries. One thing that we've been working closely with at Ramapo is we work with a university in England called Sheffield Hallam University. And together with them, we've been looking to apply, culturally, legally, ethically by the standards in the UK and get IGG adopted by police agencies in the United Kingdom. So we would love to see that, because in the UK and Ireland, those are two countries where IGG is ripe for the taking. There's a good representation of their populations in the DNA databases that we use. And so along with the United States, Canada, Sweden, and Australia, which have already been using IGG, the UK and Ireland could definitely benefit from this technology. So that's another thing I'd love to see, is that it could be used worldwide. And then finally, I would love to see it as not only a tool for cold cases, because largely over the past, 7-8 years that I've been practicing, we've seen IGG mostly used on cold cases, a few hot cases, but mostly cold cases. So I'd love to see it as something that's adopted earlier in the investigation. We don't have to wait, 20 years for this case to have no tips in order to start conducting IGG. As soon as you don't have a hit in CODIS, if you have DNA, no hit in CODIS, you can move on to investigative genetic genealogy, find out who that DNA belongs to. It's not a silver bullet that will work in every case, as you've learned from some of your other cases that you've covered on the Fall Line, but it can work in many cases.
One question that Cairenn is often asked is, how does one who's interested get into the field? And she says that answer is just not simple.
There is no requirement for investigative genetic genealogy training in order to secure work as an IGG practitioner. However, you would be silly to try to do it without having casework experience. I mean, for me, I worked for 5, 6 years as a volunteer investigative genetic genealogist before I ever got paid $1. And it doesn't need to be that extreme anymore because opportunities are coming up for more IGG practitioners to join the field. But I would hate to see people squander their time and resources by not having the tools and training available and the casework experience to work on all different types of cases. So even if you say like, oh, well, I've been helping adoptees for years. I'm really good at doing genetic genealogy. Well, have you ever worked with just GEDmatch and family tree DNA? Have you ever worked on a Puerto Rican case, an Ashkenazi Jewish case, a Latin American case? Have you ever worked on a Norwegian John or Jane Doe? All of these populations that take many, many years of experience to cover those types of casework, that can really impact your investigation. So I think that having experience and knowledge is really, really important. And I personally wouldn't like to see somebody with no training secure work as an IGG practitioner.
A lot of our listeners have been seeing the news about what is going on at 23andMe and the bankruptcy news. Can you explain the situation and your take on it? Do we need to be concerned, and are we concerned about the right things?
That's a great question. So first of all, I will say that if you're gonna just ignore what I say anyway and panic and delete your information from 23andMe, please do download it first, download your raw DNA data, and then upload it to DNA Justice, Family Tree DNA, and GEDmatch first. Because that way, first of all, you still get some benefits of having done a DNA test because you're still in some DNA databases and you're helping to solve law enforcement cases. So thank you in advance if you decide to do that. As far as the 23andMe drama, and keep in mind that I'm a bit of a glass half empty person. I know I probably sounded really glass half full this whole time that we've been talking, but I'm a little bit of a pessimist when it comes to my worldview. And so I keep on telling people, well, the things that you're concerned about are already happening to you. So if somebody wants to know information about you, you're carrying an iPhone and that captures so much information about you. That's how they advertise to you and stuff like that. So you might have an Alexa in your household and that's listening to you all the time. So you don't need to be concerned about this because there's already so many other things to be concerned about. Besides that, so actually talking about the 23andMe thing, there are laws in the United States that prohibit the use of our genetic information to do things like, raise our insurance rates and things like that. So one thing that you can do if you're really concerned about that kind of thing is advocate for genetic privacy laws. California specifically has some very tight genetic privacy laws that impact the use of, your 23andMe data for certain things. So for me personally, I'm not freaking out.
One thing you mentioned was that Ramapo is now hosting an annual conference, and by the time our listeners hear this, the conference is actually going to be happening. But of course, they can check social media to kind of see what that's like. But I would love for them to have the chance to maybe even attend or follow that next year as well. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Our conference is called RIGG, R-I-G-G, the Ramapo College Investigative Genetic Genealogy Conference, and it's held usually at the end of June each year. This year, there's going to be some amazing talks, including Amy Michael, a forensic anthropologist who's been on the show before. She's going to be showing us some bones in real life and just talking about how IGG practitioners can work with forensic anthropologists. So that's one of the many talks. A lot of case overviews. There will be a presentation about self-care for investigative genetic genealogists. Just a ton of stuff that's highly relevant. We do host webinars almost monthly. We have some that are alumni-specific webinars, and then at least 4 times a year, but usually about every other month, we host a webinar for the public. A few of those are available on YouTube. So if you go to Ramapo College's YouTube page, you'll see a few of our webinars that we've held in the past. And then over the summer, we're doing something really fun called our Summer Book Club, Summer Reading Club. And so in June, July, and August, we'll be meeting to discuss some books that talk about IGG. And the first one, you may be surprised to learn, Laurah, that we are going to be examining your book and discussing it, Lay Them to Rest, in the month of June. So that's on June 30th. And then in July, we're going to be talking about Barbara Ray Venter's book, I Know Who You Are. And then August is BYOB, Bring Your Own Book. So I think that's going to be a fun little discussion.
And is that open to the public or just alumni?
Yes, that one is open to the public and it's free. So if people go to our social media, is RCNJ _IGG on Facebook and Instagram, and you can find details about that.
Thank you so much to Cairenn Binder for joining us. If you'd like to learn about Ramapo's programs or the DNA Dope Project, you can find a link in our show notes. This summer, be sure to tune in because we'll be re-releasing several episodes that are in great need of further attention. And then we'll be back in the fall with a new season. We're also working on a collaboration with Tenderfoot TV to investigate a case right here in Atlanta and to help a family for whom justice has stalled out for the last 6 years. So please, be sure to follow our social media accounts so you'll know when that will be released. If you know of a case that should be covered on the Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And please take a moment to rate and review our show in your podcast app of choice. If you listen on Apple Podcast, please be sure to check your subscription to make sure that you're set for automatic download so that you don't miss an episode. And if you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon or Apple Premium. Through both platforms, you can gain early ad-free access to our episodes. The Fall Line's Patreon and Apple Premium support our Family Therapy Fund and actively pay for therapy for families who've appeared on the show. My book, Lay Them to Rest, is out everywhere. Find out more through the link in our show notes. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laurah Norton, with additional research assistance by Melissa Gold. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Vic Kennedy and Brandy C. Williams. Special thanks to Liz Lipka.